Hello and good morning from Vienna. This is Alexander Batthyány. I'm pre-recording this because when you watch me talking to you, it's going to be 3 o'clock in the morning in Vienna. A bit too early or a bit too late to talk live to you. So the Congress organizers wisely suggested to us European attendants or presenters to pre-record our talk, and I'm very happy to be able to talk to you. Of course, it would be much nicer, I don't need to tell you, to meet in person. Anyone and everyone who has ever been to one of these enormously beautiful and special World Congresses in Dallas knows what I'm talking about, and those who don't know will perhaps find out in 2 years. There's a special connection which I will nonetheless try to convey to you. As you know, spirit is beyond time and space, and it tells us a lot about personhood, if that is really so. So I'm right now imagine talking to you rather than only to my iPhone while my family is on holidays and I'm here alone in my office talking to my iPhone. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again. I would like to say that missing has a special quality this year as we all mourn and lament the passing on of Dr. Bob Barnes, the Spiritus Rector and Director of the Viktor Frankl Institute of Logotherapy. He called me, I think, a few months ago and asked me whether I would like to give a keynote for this Congress, and I happily said yes. I always said yes to Bob, I think, when he asked me. And he said, yeah, but choose a topic of whatever you like. And then when I told him that I would like to talk about the topic I talk about today, namely on the convergence or the overlaps, the amazing and beautiful overlaps between the psychology of death and dying on the one hand and logotherapy on the other, and in fact there are two hands together, he said, yes, go for it, and he really liked the topic. So in a certain way I would like to offer my talk as a farewell gift or as the special honor, twice special honor, to fulfill a promise to Dr. Bob, and as an expression of my gratitude and as a thank you note. I would also like to thank, briefly, the Congress organizers who took it upon them to organize this Congress in no doubt difficult times to organize a Congress. The COVID crisis is strong and we have to see how it develops. But for the moment, these were difficult times, and I would like to thank them, and I would like to thank you for attending to this talk, to this Congress, and for keeping the candle burning. It's very important that it keeps burning, especially in these times when I believe logotherapists will be needed more than ever, or are needed more than ever. So my topic, I should perhaps briefly explain. The title of my talk is Meaning Here Now, or Meaning Here and Now, Lessons from Logotherapy and the Psychology of Death and Dying. So how comes that I chose this topic? And I think a brief introduction into why and how also is a brief introduction or setting the scene for what is going to come. And it goes like this. A few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I started a research group at Vienna University and also at my research chair in Liechtenstein, which looks at the study of the psychology of death and dying. One inspiration for this was the encounter of a beautifully led hospice in Moscow in Russia, where the Moscow course of the Moscow Institute, where I'm a visiting professor, had some beautiful contacts with people who are actually caring for those who are dying, and they brought home a very important lesson to begin with. Not a lesson on my list, but a very important lesson nonetheless. And it goes like this. And in the meanwhile, I heard this and saw this confirmed on many different layers. If you try to work in the field of psychology of death and dying, it is very often not so much that you have to know what to say, but that you have to know how to listen, not only with your head, but also with your heart. And this I saw on many layers, and perhaps we're going to talk about this later on today. But not only that, when our research group started this research, and we had a special emphasis on how people with dementia, Alzheimer's and so on, how they cope with death and dying and how their life closes, we observed something, and my students and me observed something which was incredibly simple and at the same time incredibly beautiful, namely that after a long day of writing research protocols, if you then look in your research diary, what you find is that in the footnotes, in the small print, so to speak, things you noted down during the day, you find some observations which might not be the core of your research project. And our core research project was on how, or is on how to help those who take care of those who are dying, so caregivers, but also family, relatives, and friends, how to show to them or how to help them to be there when someone is dying. And the research goal, so to speak, is to somehow help on the mission that fewer people die alone. And by alone, we don't mean physical presence. Many people might be around in the hospital, but we mean psychological and spiritual inner presence, because you can sit next to each other and you can be miles and worlds apart, because anxiety, fear, a certain unwillingness to confront mortality or to confront this person's mortality might hinder you from really reaching out, from really having a heart-to-heart communication with those who are dying. And therefore, many, many people today die alone, even though they die, maybe many people gather around them and yet they're fairly alone. I would like to illustrate this with a story which also set me going in this. There was a time when all fingers pointed in this direction, and it's about the death of the famous Russian composer and piano player Sergei Rachmaninov. And it's said that he was one of those Russians who had to leave Russia in order to escape Stalin's terror, and was living, I think, with Rubinstein and others who were living in Beverly Hills, in the Russian quarter of Beverly Hills, many musicians. And when he was on his last concert tournée, he fell gravely ill. So he had to be brought back to his house in Beverly Hills, and it was the very same house about which he earlier had said, "This is going to be the house where I will die. This is my last home on earth." So I think in the late 1940s, it was time to die. And there he was on his deathbed, surrounded by a few people, and he was breathing his last breath, and everything was very silent. And suddenly Rachmaninov gets up again and says to those around him, "And can you hear this beautiful melody, the beautiful music?" And the others around his deathbed looked. Nobody heard anything. And they insisted, "No, there's no music here." And he said, and Rachmaninov said, "Yes, but can't you hear this beautiful melody? It's so..." And they said, No, there's nothing here." So finally Rachmaninov gave up and he says, "Okay, so then the music is only in my head." And he lay down and died. Now, what happened there was something which happens not too infrequently, namely not the melody, but what the surrounding people did, or rather did not do. Namely, what would it have cost them to ask him, "What kind of music are you hearing?" Or, "Would you like to share the melody?" I mean, here's the one of the greatest Russian composers of the century. dying, and he's saying at his deathbed, I'm hearing a beautiful melody. Wouldn't it be the nearest question to ask, whistle it to us, sum it to us, let us share this last moment. Nobody asked. So this is what I mean, or this is one of the findings, one of the observations, which led to our research project on helping those who are dying not to die alone. Not only physically, but to teach or to help others be there. And one of the secondary findings of this is that if people learn this, if people connect to this, not only their death and dying process is going to be much easier, but also their life will receive a new quality. So this is our research project. And in this project, once again, there were many side observations which were far, far, far too important and too valuable, too many treasures and diamonds to just let them fall to the ground. So these are the unsung or the sung melodies which we is not only me, but the research groups I'm heading in this topic collected. It's a collection of about 25 important lessons at this moment, and I think it's going to grow because it's an ocean of wisdom and mercy, and we are still collecting. But for the moment, for this topic, or for this lecture, these are about 9 to 10 lessons, which also happen, once again, to very well overlap and align with logotherapy. So this talk is about these footnotes on our research diaries, and I would also like to quote a friend of mine, a philosopher, whom I recently talked about this, and he said something very nice, and this is something which is also retrospectively giving a certain motto or program to our research and also to this talk. And it goes like this: birth is a mystery. To become is a mystery. To become a person is an even greater mystery. And any one of you who also is a parent, I've got 2 daughters, knows that the arrival of a new person is poetry, but this poetry points towards a mystery. It is something enormous which is happening. And the same goes, or something similar goes, for death and dying. Death is a mystery, and every religion, every philosopher, every philosophy, or at least most of them, also tackled with the question, what does it mean to die? What is there at the end? And in the middle of it, life is also a mystery. And this friend of mine told me about, he's an elderly gentleman, after a very long time of studying and teaching philosophy at university, he said, I think finally I understood something very, very valuable. A bit late, but I understood it. And it goes like this: life is a mystery and not a riddle. It's not a riddle to be solved, like a scientist or an academic likes to solve riddles, but it is a mystery to be lived, and you might add, to be filled with meaning and maturity and the fulfillment or the unfoldment of our individuality, and so on. So to a certain degree, there is the saying about the light at the end of the tunnel, and some of our research also looks at the near-death experience. I'm not going to talk about this today, but to some degree, if you do this research, what you feel, or what you have, the idea is that this light at the end, somehow can radiate back on this mystery of life, on everyday life, and somehow enlighten it, and somehow bring with it some information which is crucial for our everyday lives. So this is why I called my talk Meaning Here and Now. This is not going to be about research, even though I like to talk about research. What is even more important is how we live life, and what we can learn about live life, and the wisdom of those who are a little or much older, and who are closer to the last mystery than perhaps many of us are, or at least know that we are. So I would like to start with my first lesson, so to speak, And this is not so much a lesson, but rather an important finding, which is that if you believe that there's meaning in life or meaning of life, and logotherapists tend to do believe this meaning is there with or without us. It doesn't depend on us. Yeah? The fulfillment of meaning in our life depends on our realizing this meaning, but the actual presence of meaning is independent of us. It is there. The only question is, how do we relate to it? Yeah? But there are certain phenomena which very much depend on us, because we are the only ones, the only living entities on this planet who bring it to Earth. And one of the most crucial ones is hope. Yeah? Hope is a phenomenon which you only find in the human psyche. You only find it with human persons. In the animal kingdom, you have no trace of hope. You have looking forward to a reward, but looking forward is not the same as hoping. Hoping has a different flavor. And the flavor of hope basically is saying that you have the hope or the trust or the intention to heal a broken world, to heal a world very, very much in need of healing, very, very much in need of compassion, very much in need of benevolence, very much in need of us. Yeah? And I think this is a small lesson, and yet it's a very big one, because on the one hand, and again talking as a researcher, it is a bit sobering to see that once you see the role of hope and you look up in the psychology dictionary or in the PsycInfo database of research articles, you find very little on hope. Hope is an open secret. It stares you in the face, but it's so obvious on the one hand, and it's therefore very well hidden because it doesn't fit a perhaps slightly reductionist trend in scientific research, where you tend to look at simpler phenomena, and yet you have something which is uniquely, specifically human, but at the research side, but which is crucial for the inner survival of personhood, of mankind, of the world, yeah, is that we don't give up hope. And we need to say this these days, because to heal a broken world is a project which is often hindered or smiled upon or laughed upon, because it sounds so lofty, by a zeitgeist which doesn't so much strive and grow with hope, but rather looks at the world with a certain indifference or cynicism or nihilism or materialism and so on. So we have to protect this hope, because just imagine, if we are the bearers of hope, and if we give it up, it will disappear from the face of the earth tracelessly. Nothing will be left behind of it. Yeah? And I think you don't need much fantasy and not much imagination to imagine how a world will look like if hope has been eliminated. It will not be a good world. It will not be good for us, and it will not be good for the world. So this is less a finding, but something which I think we need to keep in mind. And to those who are psychologists and would like to do research on this, in Vienna we just start a research project on hope, but it's hard to measure. There are no test instruments. There's very little research going on, and yet it is such an enormously beautiful and important phenomenon. So let's look at it. But from a personal perspective, from a day-to-day living perspective, it is something which we need to keep as a background measure also for the lessons I'm going to talk about next. The first one, the really first one we hear from those at the end of life or from this field, goes like this. And it deals with the topic of inner poverty. So there's inner wealth on the one side, but there's also inner poverty. And many people suffer from this, and we hear this in the clinical research talks about this, the zeitgeist talks about this, that people say that they have the impression that they feel impoverished in their inner lives, in their personal lives, because they don't receive enough. And the interesting message is that it looks like as if we are impoverished not so much because we don't get enough, but because paradoxically, but because we don't give enough. Now let this sink in. The idea is, or the message is, that it is not so much that we are mentally poor because we are not loved, or we are not appreciated, or we don't get the praise we think we deserve, but rather it's the other way around. Our inner poverty comes about because we don't share these things, because we don't give out, because we expect too much of a feedback, and thereby we become beggars rather than kings, because we are begging for something which we would have if we only gave of it. Yeah, I would like to illustrate this by a teaching tale or a story. My teacher, Elisabeth Lucas, with whom I'm in close contact still today, once wrote in a book or in a lecture, and I think it was in the lecture, and she talked about a very nice example about it's a story, there are two villages, and they are apart by, let's say, a few kilometers, yeah, and there's a little path connecting these two villages. And one day on this path, there's an elderly lady, a farmer lady, who's 80 or something older, and she carries a basket with pears, sweet and delicious pears, ripe and good. But for her, she did this for for many decades, for 70 years, for 60 years. But now that she's older, the weight is a bit too much for her, and it takes her a long time, and the basket is very heavy, and so on. And along comes a young man and sees this basket and sees the lady. He looks at the lady, he looks at the basket, he looks at the lady, he looks at the basket, and then he sees the pears in the basket, and they look very delicious. And he thinks, well, I'd like to have a few of them. But if I'm going to ask her, would you like to give me, or please give me some pears, she will in all likelihood say, young man, thank you, but why should I? No? So he thinks, well, let's be clever. This basket is very heavy for her, not for me. And he goes to the lady and says, can I help you carrying the basket to the village you're heading for? And she looks at him and says, with gratitude, thank you very much. So he takes it and he brings it to the village. And then they arrive there, and out of gratitude, she thanks him. And then she says, you know what, young man, please accept a little gift as an expression of my gratitude. Take 3 of these pears. And he takes them. And what can he tell to himself? Well done. Yeah, it worked out. I had a deal, I had a tactic, a strategy, and it very well worked out. It is also possible, however, speaking about hope, that we could expect from another young man, same situation, or perhaps even the same, that once again, an elderly lady with a basket, a young man seeing the lady, seeing the delicious pears, and then again seeing the lady, the farmer, and he's telling her, and he's thinking, well, this is very heavy for her, and perhaps she did this for a long time, for her children, for her grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I think now is the time that I take over. And he goes to her and he says, I see this is a heavy basket. Can I take it for you? And she says in gratitude, thank you very much, yes, please. And he brings the basket to the village. Now they arrive at the village, and the lady says, thank you very much, and out of gratitude, would you like to accept the gift of 3 of these pears? And he says, thank you, and takes them and enjoys them, relishes them. What will he say to himself? He won't say, well done. He will say, good that I was there. At this moment that I was there, it was good. Yeah. Now, if we think a little further, it is also possible that the lady will not give a gift of gratitude, and she will just say, thank you very much, young man, you are very kind, yeah, and that's it. In the first case, the young man will no longer say, well done, great strategy. he will say, I feel cheated, I was stupid, why did I help her? She didn't give anything to me. In the second case, however, nobody and no one and nothing can take away the knowledge that it was good that he was there. Yeah. So to be able to say, and this goes for the living as well, for the dying, to be able to say, good that I am here, good that I was there, yeah, is one of the most precious gifts. And this gift also goes by another name, meaning. Meaning, to fulfill meaning means that without you, something wouldn't have come into existence, which is very worthwhile, and it would have been very sad if it didn't come into existence, because you helped it along, no? So we get poorer if we are walking around like beggars, and we get enormously rich if we give out, yeah? And this connects us to the next lesson, so to speak, and this is also something valuable, I think, and helpful. Namely, it goes about the enormously mystifying and generous and slightly illogical economy of existential things. Now, let me explain something. In the history of science, you often find the idea of the perpetuum mobile. What is it? It's a machine which generates more energy than you put in. This sounds like a wonderful idea. It would solve many problems, but given the law of physics, it's not possible. Why? Because there's a steady amount of energy in this universe, and if you see a machine or a transformator which is supposedly producing energy, it never does produce energy. It only takes energy in one form and translates or transforms it into an energy which we then can use. So if we have a solar power system, it doesn't produce energy. It only takes sun, warmth and heat, and transforms it into electricity, which we can then use for the plugs. No, and the same goes for water, for oil, whatever. There's a steady state of energy. Very briefly, in the physical world, you can only get so much out of a system as you put in before. Yeah, and for some reason, so for mechanics, that's a very valid thing, and that's how physics work. Yeah, but it is not so when it comes to existential things. Let me just go back. So if we talk about having to receive something before we can give it, there's also a simple example. If I have $20, I must receive them and someone must earn them. And then I walk through town and see 10 beggars. I can give each of them $2. But in the end, my pockets will be empty because I can only give as much as I received before. Otherwise, it would be much nicer, but that's not how it works. So physical resources are dependent on previous input. You can only give as much as you received before. Yeah? This is not true, however, for those things which really count. Those things which really count follow a very strange arithmetic, a beautiful one. Namely, it goes like this. If I feel benevolence, or if I feel love to a person, next to the fact that I promised love to my wife exclusively, but I'm talking about friendship love, yeah? Or kindness. If I feel kindness, friendship, love to a person, it is not that my reservoir of kindness, yeah, now is x minus 1 because I already like one person, and if I'm doing compassionate work, like talking to people who are in difficult situations or who are close to death and dying, or who are caring for those who are dying, it is not that if I spend, let's say, a few words with one person, it's not that the amount of words I have available for expressing my compassion now is declining because I already gave so much compassion to one person. It's the contrary. The more I give, the more I try it, the kinder you are, yeah, the more natural kindness will flow through you. It is not so much that we are the source of it, yeah. It's more like that we are a channel of it, and the reservoir in existence, in life, seems to be limitless. Yeah. So what does it mean? It means that, in principle, anyone and everyone who's complaining that in this broken world there's so little love, so little kindness, so little kind personhood, yeah, could change, can, and perhaps needs to change it right now, yeah, rather than complaining that there's so little of it. Send it out, bring it in, because once you start, yeah, it flows without end, yeah. So if there's poverty, I mean inner poverty and psychological and spiritual poverty in this world, the solution is very simple. Start right away to share your light. Yeah. So this is a very, I think, important lesson. I'm very grateful to especially two people whose case histories I recorded and perhaps one day will write about, who shared this in a very strong way, and I'm very grateful for this. And I hope you can also relate to this. Good. I hope you're ready for the next finding, and that's something simple and beautiful at the same time. And it goes like this. There's a common observation, sometimes people tell us, and we, or perhaps even ourselves think so, that we came here, we were entering this world without a manual on how to live and what we are here for, and what's the nature of nature, and what is our nature, what can we, should we become, should we do. And so it seems that we are slightly at loss at the beginning, and many people are at loss anyway. So, and the question is that really so? And it took me at least quite a while to figure something out, which is very simple, namely that perhaps we did not come here with a how to live life manual, but something in our biography and something in our coming about and becoming grown-ups has an important lesson and equips us with a certain seal of the nature of the essence of being. And it goes like this. In contrast to every other living entity on earth, human beings are enormously vulnerable for the first 10, 12, 15, 16 years. There's no other species, there's no other type of living entity which needs so much care and which wouldn't survive a single day out in the wilderness were it not for someone or many people, or at least a couple of people, who took care of us. We wouldn't have survived a day out there. So it's in the nature of our survival and our coming about, becoming grown-ups, or adolescents and grown-ups, that somebody took care of us. And those of you who are also peasant parents know what this means. It means a number of sleepless nights because the baby is crying. It means a lot of worries because, you want to protect this young life. And it actually means a lot of care, and it means a lot of benevolence, and it means an enormous amount of love. So, however well, not every childhood is a good childhood, I do know, but someone at least must have been interested enough in us. Someone at least must have seen the promise every person truly is, yeah, to give so many sacrifices, to sacrifice so much for us, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And to those who haven't been growing up with their parents, it's even more of a miracle, because then you can't say, yes, it was the mother instinct or the father instinct. No, especially there's someone who didn't have this, jumped over his or her own shadow, so to speak, and took care of you, of us. Yeah. So once again, we didn't come here with a manual, but we came with something much, much more credible, namely with evidence of being loved and being wanted. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived a day, 3 days out in the wilderness without us, without parents, without caretakers, without someone sharing and caring and feeding and warming us and cuddling and holding us and teaching us language and so on. We wouldn't be here. So I think this is a very obvious thing, and at the same time, it seems to be that nature shared a lot about our nature by giving us this lifespan development. It is the recipe of life, and so the recipe of life is benevolence and caring and sharing. And you sometimes wonder why a contemporary zeitgeist would tempt us or seduce us to mistrust this recipe and exchange it for a much harsher, indifferent, and even downright hostile mentality, when there's such a beautiful lesson in us. We don't need even to read a book for this or listen to a teacher or to anyone. We just have to look and ponder a little bit about how did I get here? I mean, not only on earth, but how did I get to this point where I can even think about this using words and being alive for this. Yeah. So this is an important lesson, I think. Once again, there's very little research on this. How do people find out? I only know that Elisabeth Lucas, in a fairly recent book on family therapy, developed as a catalog of questions for those who are complaining about, feeling that their childhood wasn't so good, and that might be the case. But to balance the picture, she already also asked her patients, now next to complaining, would you like to tell me what your parents did for you? And then suddenly it dawns on us, and this is true for everyone, somebody really did a lot for us, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So at the beginning of our existence, of our lifespan, there's an enormous amount of love. And as I told you earlier on, part of our work is that we further or nurture a culture that a similar kind of love and togetherness is also possible at the other end of the lifespan, namely when we are dying, so that people are not alone, their inner lives are not alone, because somebody can relate to them again. Yeah, and in the middle, I mean, it's not that you can't have too much love around you anyway. So this is lesson number 5. Lesson number 6 looks not so much at us, but at the world. And this is something important also. Not only the child needs our love, and not only we as logotherapists or just as people who are interested in the fate of the earth and the world, it's not only about psychology, it's also very much about the world, because the world is in need. I earlier said that we are living in a broken world. Unfortunately, that's true, and you don't need to travel far. Sometimes it's only a few bus stations or a few flight hours to see how much suffering there is and how much we could actually do or can do. And the brokenness of this world tells us a lot, and it's also one of the strongest arguments for meaning. Very often, and maybe some of you encounter this too, when people learn what you're doing and you're doing this meaning-oriented, and you have this unconditional idea that really meaning is out there. Students sometimes tell me, yeah, but look at this world. Look at the pain, the suffering, the injustice, the carelessness, the egotism. Look at the darkness around you, and then again, please tell me that life has meaning. No, this is the challenge. And the answer to this challenge is fairly simple. Precisely because there is so much darkness, because there is so much brokenness all around, yeah. This is the strongest message of meaning. This is what tells us, yes, you are needed. Your work is needed. You're radiating kindness and benevolence, and doing something for it is needed more than ever. If there wasn't brokenness, all which would have been left for us to do is to feel gratitude. Just sit back and say, thank you, thank you, thank you. So we would just have experiential values. But we are also creative. We are co-creators to a certain extent. So, and why are we needed? because this is a broken world and we need, at least in the amount we can do, fix it here or there, heal it, what needs to be healed. Yeah. So this is, I think, a strong point against nihilism, against cynicism, against indifference, is precisely the brokenness is the strongest call for meaning. Yeah. And this also goes for the sometimes theologians discuss the question of what does suffering mean. I think, in all honesty, there is not going to be a very rational earthly answer what it means, but there's a very clear answer and call to the question, what does it mean for us? Namely, it means do something about it. Yeah? Help, console, be compassionate, or be a role model in, as Frankl said, by realizing attitudinal values. In other words, showing that even if all is gone, not everything is gone, because there's a remainder, and this is the most important essence of personhood at every stage of life. This is another lesson which I'm not going to talk about today, is that what you see at the end of life is that even if everything is taken, even the last breath is taken away from us, there's much more to personhood than we can sometimes even imagine during our normal everyday lifetimes. Yeah? So this is lesson number 5. I have to hurry up. Lesson number 6 is not so much a lesson from the death and dying, but it aligns very well, and it comes from one of the lesser quoted sayings of Viktor Frankl. I often quote them because I think it's a very important one. In German it's beautiful. It says, jede Tatsache, die wir vorfinden, ist unvollendet. Each fact we find in life is incomplete. Something is lacking. Our final touch is waiting. Yeah. So this is very simple to answer when there's something which is not ideal. Of course, if you see it and if you have the ability to change it, your call is clear. When it comes to something beautiful and everything is fine and you see a beautiful piece of art or a beautiful thing in nature or sunset or spring or summer is coming, or a beautiful person is in front of you, you may wonder, how could this be an incomplete fact? Very simple. Because if you pass by as if it was nothing, something is lacking, namely your recognition of this beauty, our recognition of this beauty. So there is, whatever we find in life, Frankl was, I think, quite right, it is to a certain degree incomplete because it somehow needs our imprint. Be it only a loving glance or be it a lot of work, depends on what the fact is, but there's always something to be done. Once again, meaning means that we make a difference, and the difference is making a fact, a warm fact, a beautiful fact, somehow contributes to the healing of the world or to the beauty of this world. Yeah. Lesson number 7, and time is running. It's very simple and it goes like this. We cannot change the whole world, even if you want to. But this is nothing to lament about, because we can change our world, and that makes a difference which counts. In other words, so if we walk around, we see much which is important, but maybe it's not our task. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed, and sometimes people who take it in the wrong way also feel that meaning calls are addressed to them when in fact they are not, because it's another sphere. And then they tend to say, well, yes, if I can't change this, why do anything? And what can I change? And the truth is, everyone, every day, affects the world around us. Every day, every smile, every kind word we say, or harsh word we send out, affects, has a ripple effect. Yeah, it continues to move on. Yeah, and therefore we always interact with this. You cannot not interact with the world, and therefore you cannot not affect it. We always affect our world. So if we do so anyway, do it in a meaningful way. And this is also the simplest answer to those who, that's at least I found out, who think that, who wonder what is their meaning, what is their call in life. And the answer sometimes is very simple. Do the needful, do what you have to do anyway, but bring in your kindness, bring in your own signature. This is me, yeah? So it's not only what we do, it's also how we are doing it. So it need not be the huge, piano piece or the wonderful book you write. It can be everyday life. And this everyday life, if you do it in a dignified way, if you bring in your benevolence, if you radiate what you are, and we as persons are much more than we can even dream of, yeah, then we affect our world. And so we cannot change the whole world, unfortunately not, but we can change our world, fortunately enough. And what a great responsibility and what an enormous gift of freedom and sharing from ourselves and meaning. Yeah, I come to the second last lesson, and this relates very much to what I said earlier on. And this is the lesson of the dying, I think the most important one. And it says that at the end, it will not so much count, perhaps it won't even count what we received, because this is not ours, it belongs to somebody else, to those who send it out. But what will count is what we send out. Yeah. So it's very rarely, if ever, does it happen that somebody is lying on his or her deathbed and thinks and ponders about his or her life and thinks, well, I should have received more, whatever, appreciation, acknowledgement, money, yeah, you name it, even love. A few people will say, very, very few people, I encountered, I think almost zero, but most will say, the value of my life is measured by what I send out, because what I send out somehow is mine. These effects, ripple effects, these effects are my effects. I send this out. This belongs to me. So if somebody is unfriendly to you, it's their unfriendliness. It's not your unfriendliness. Yeah. If somebody is kind to you, it's your joy, but it is their kindness, not yours. And if you want to have your kindness, you need to be kind. Yeah. So this is what is meant by this. Yeah. People measure, and I think rightly so, realistically so, their wealth, what they are leaving behind, and perhaps take with them in the way we can't really understand at this time. It is what they have given, and which very much aligns to what I said earlier on, namely that our poverty or our wealth does not depend on what we existentially, does not so much depend on what we get, but on what we send out. Yeah, this is very much what you hear over and over and over again in the palliative care, in the hospices, in these stations. People, if they ponder and wonder about the meaning of their lives, never do they ask, did I get enough? But always do they ask, did I send out enough? Yeah, and why did I keep this rather than sharing this? My kindness, my compassion, my creativity, my joy, and so on. Yeah. So this also has a sideline, which I wrote down on the day when I first listened to this, and it really dawned on me that the best preparation for a good death, and at least that's what we are learning, is not happening at the end of life. It's happening right now. And this also aligns with a lot of research in this field of the psychology of death and dying. If you want to prepare for a good life and a good death, yeah, it's time to be generous. It's time to share, because this will remain with us in one way or the other. Yeah. Good. I come to the final lesson. And the final lesson is something which Viktor Frankl said, but also which we find echoed in many case histories and many conversations, namely, and I will, yeah. And the lesson is, there is a problem of unexperienced happiness in our lives. Now, the term unexperienced happiness, unerlebte Fröhlichkeit oder unerlebtes Glück, is something which I owe to a person I once counseled, or I happened to be there when something happened. And I will tell this story because the story is a teaching tale happening in real life. And it goes like this. Now imagine a pedestrian area, like in every nice city, at least here in Europe, you have many pedestrian areas and people walk, and there are bookstores and flower shops and bakeries and clothing stores, what have you. And the story is about a young woman who went to a medical doctor to get a normal checkup, like you do every year for, TSH, for the thyroid hormones and other things, blood values. And she did this with her doctor. Everything's fine, she thought. And then she comes, and then she has a follow-up appointment with her doctor. And she goes there, and while she goes there, his office is on this pedestrian area, and it's a spring day, and while she goes there, she passes the flower shop and the bookstore, and she briefly glances at the shop window and sees the books she would like to read in the coming month or so. And in the clothing store, she sees the new fashion for the next season, and she's looking forward to summer, it's springtime now. And there she goes, and the flowers smell great and so on. And she sees many other people who walk by normal everyday life as she does. And then she enters the building of her doctor, her medical doctor, and she goes up to his office. She takes place in the waiting room, and there she looks at the magazines, and she sees new holiday destinations, some islands, some beautiful forestry, whatever. And then she reads about the new opera and theater performances coming up for the next season. And finally, it's time. The doctor comes out, calls her in, and a bit in contrast to his usual self, he looks very serious. And he tells her that he looked at the blood values, the lab values, and they don't seem quite okay. And he says we need to do another test because we have to do a tumor marker, because it's your blood values might hint at cancer. And so he draws blood again, and he says, come back in about a few days. We're going to call you. We're going to get the results soon enough. So she passes by on the way out of the waiting room area. Her glance meets the magazines she just read about the holiday destinations, about the theater performances. And then she's out there on the pedestrian area, and she walks past by the bookstore, the flower store, the bakery. And everything is in a new light, Something is not quite as it used to be. And then she looks at the faces of the other people, and she thinks, and this is where the term comes from, these people are enormously lucky. But what they experience, or what they do is, what they display is unexperienced happiness. In other words, they have lost sight of the many, many, many reasons for gratitude and happiness, appreciation, of what we think is normal everyday life and which we always take for granted. And then a few days later, the doctor called her in again, and she walks the same pedestrian area, which looks very different now given what's happening inside her. And she goes to the waiting area. This time she doesn't read the magazines. She's too anxious. And then the doctor opens his usual self, smiling, beaming, telling her, I've got very good news and I'm sorry for the fright you experienced, but this was an artifact. Everything is fine with you. So go in peace. You're released. And then she walks down and she passes by the waiting room area, and suddenly these magazines radiate again. Hope, promise, what's going to come. And she walks on the pedestrian area, and can you imagine how much light she radiates and how much light is in her world? And what is this light? It's the light of gratitude for something which has always, or at least for a very long time, been there, and now she has it back. And this is, I think, what Frankl means or meant when he wrote, I don't know how this is in English, but the German one-to-one translation would be, his definition of happiness is that which we haven't had to endure, what we don't have to endure. In other words, what we are spared of. Yeah, because this gives us a proper understanding of gratitude. And just imagine, just put yourself in the shoes of this person and perhaps then move away from her shoes to your own shoes, to our own shoes, and we see the problem of unexperienced happiness abounding all around. Yeah. So, but it need not be like this. Yeah, there are some reasons why our organism, our attention is always drawn to those things which are in need. This is biologically very useful, evolutionary, adaptive, that our attention is, I'm not here telling myself, I'm glad I don't have headaches, toothaches, and so on. But what is good for us in a biological way is not necessarily good for us in an existential way, namely that we forget to see how much is functioning, how much is in order, how much is good, yeah, and we pass by living our days with unexperienced happiness. Yeah, so this is a type of meditation or method to sometimes remind ourselves how much is fine in our lives, and then change from unexperienced to the experience of happiness or gratitude. Yeah, and also if you combine what I said earlier on the enormous resources of love and kindness we have, if we are looking for a first ignition, a first moment where we can set ourselves going and say, look, let me be the beginning of a chain reaction of kindness by giving, by sharing. If we look for a good reason for this, the change, the movement from unexperienced to experienced happiness would be a good starter. Yeah. So to sum it up, there's much more, and perhaps in 2 years, if you like, and if the Congress organizers agree to this, I'd be happy to share more. Once again, our collection of good ideas and important ideas is growing almost daily. But for the moment, this is what I wanted to share. I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope some of the things I said stick, and I hope that some of them, in all humility, have been helpful. Speaking of humility and modesty, I should really add something, should really say something. Many of the wise things I said today are not grown on my wisdom, but rather on the wisdom of those people who are long gone now, but who use their last moments, sometimes days or weeks, to share these important lessons. Share them with us, and allowed me to share them with you, or perhaps sooner or later also a larger audience. I'm currently writing up a few of these things, and I hope this is a message of hope. Yeah, because once again, let's remind ourselves, this was the background against which all of this stood. It's the fact that we are about to heal a broken world, so much in need of it. And with this, I release you. I thank you very much for listening to this keynote lecture. I thank you, I thank Bob once again for inviting me to give this keynote lecture on this topic. And I wish you a wonderful Congress, a wonderful time. Those speakers coming after me, I wish all the best to them, and to the experience to talk to your iPhone, which is a bit strange, but I feel personally that given that spirit is beyond time and space, that somehow we connected, and I thank you for that. All the best and bye-bye from Vienna.